The scent hit you before the door creaked open. That earthy, clinging mixture of spilled ale, sweat, rushes steeped in grease and fire smoke. You might have smelled it from the next village if the wind was right. The tavern wasn't a building you found on a map. It was a low-leaning timber structure you drifted toward the same way moths leaned toward candlelight. And in the 14th century, there were few spaces where you were both anonymous and welcome. A tavern was one of them. You stepped through that sagging wooden door, often held up more by rusted hinges than by carpentry, and into something dim, hot and alive. The dirt floor might be covered in damp straw or old rushes, sometimes both. Your feet, probably bare or wrapped in stiff woolen socks, would press into the uneven ground, feeling the hidden shapes of fish bones, broken nutshells, and perhaps something worse. It didn't matter. No one cared, not even you. Above you, the smoke had nowhere to go. Chimneys were a luxury, so the soot swirled around like spirits. The ceilings were low and blackened. A single iron hook dangled from a beam, used last week to hold a lantern, and last year to hold a thief by the collar. You ducked. Everyone ducked. At the far end, behind a table that leaned like a man with a limp, stood the alewife. Her apron stained, her face bored, her hands never stopping. She might be ladling out stew or shaking a sleeping guest by the ear, or pouring muddy beer into wooden mugs. If you asked for wine, she'd laugh. If you asked for water, she'd laugh harder. You didn't come here for water. No one did. Taverns weren't just about drink. They were about warmth, emotional as much as physical. The hearth always burned, even if it was mostly smoke and embers. Men huddled close to it, their boots off, drying out from walking across marsh and forest to get here. Travelers brought news, but more often they brought exaggeration. A woman with a cart missing 2 wheels. A mason with more stories than stones. A friar who talked about sins with too much interest. Each face turned toward the fire and the drink, and slowly the day became forgettable. The food, if you were lucky, was thin pottage. It might be flavored with leeks or garlic or nothing at all. The bread was dark and thick, chewy and edged, with ash. Meat, if available, was heavily salted and shredded beyond recognition. You didn't complain. You chewed, slowly, quietly, and you drank. The ale was brewed here, or next door, or last month. There was no real system. It was warm, sometimes sour and cloudy, with floating bits that no one bothered to name. You drank it because it was safer than the well and because it loosened the rope of your thoughts. It wasn't quiet. People talked, loudly. Dice clacked on tables. A lute might pluck a tune that sagged more than sang. No one kept rhythm. Children wandered in and out. No one knew whose they were, and no one asked. Dogs curled under benches. A chicken might flap into a corner. You might leave with fleas or bruises or a new job. All were equally likely. Taverns in medieval Europe weren't glamorous. They weren't clean. They weren't even particularly safe. But they were necessary. They were a fireplace when your own had gone cold. A roof when you'd lost yours. A laugh when the road had been silent too long. The social glue of the Middle Ages wasn't ink or coin. It was stories, shared in places like this. One man would tell of a knight who vanished into a mist near the forest. Another would swear he saw the Virgin Mary's face in a spilled ale stain. People listened, or pretended to, because what mattered was not truth, but togetherness. And when the night grew long and the flames dimmed, you might curl under a table or against the wall. If the alewife was kind, she'd throw a blanket over you. If she wasn't, you'd use your coat, if you had one. And when the morning came, and someone opened the door again, you'd blink at the light and pretend you hadn't cried in your sleep. What does it say about a time and place when the tavern was safer than the church? By the second night, if you stayed, you learned the tavern had rules. Not written ones, of course, but firm ones. More enduring than the law of the king and more immediate than anything the church could threaten. These were rules enforced not by swords or scrolls, but by glances, silences, and the tilt of a drinking bench. The first and most sacred rule: don't cross the alewife. She wasn't just the one pouring the drink. She was judge, landlord, treasurer, and sometimes executioner. Her word was the floor beneath your boots. You did not argue with the woman who controlled the tap. If she said you were too drunk, you were. If she said you owed her a halfpenny from 3 weeks ago, you did. If she threw your cup into the fire, it was because you deserved it, even if you didn't know why. Alewives ran many of these places across Europe. Widows, tough daughters, women who understood grain and gossip in equal measure. They brewed the ale, stoked the fires, and memorized the debts. Most couldn't read. Didn't need to, they read people instead. She might greet you with a nod one night and turn her back the next. And if she ever smiled at you genuinely, it probably meant you'd been accepted into the strange little flock that gathered beneath her smoky rafters. And that flock, what a collection of limbs and secrets it was. There was the old soldier, who never talked about war, but always sat with his back to the wall. The potter with cracked hands who laughed at nothing and stared too long at the fire. A boy who came in alone every night, sold flint out of a pouch, and then vanished before dawn. A woman with one eye who said she'd been a midwife, a thief, and a nun, but never in that order. You didn't ask questions, you listened, you shared stories of your own. Invented ones, half-truths, truths so boring they sounded made up. Sometimes it was just easier to say you were from over the hills and leave it at that. Most others were too. Travelers brought new songs, a verse from York, a melody from Calais, lyrics borrowed from a church hymn and twisted into something drinkable. If someone had a lute, they'd strum. If not, someone would hum. And if you didn't know the words, you'd learn them. Or not. No one cared. Taverns were open to all, but not all were welcome. If a tax collector entered, the laughter stopped. If a bailiff came in, the door might lock behind him. A priest? Depends. Some priests drank more than their flock, but too many questions, too many sermons, and suddenly no one remembered your name. You'd sit in a corner, ignored, until you left. Or until someone made you leave. And then there were nights of trouble. Not bar brawls, not the kind you see in paintings or films. Most medieval folk didn't want to fight. A bad injury meant weeks without work or walking, but tension still sparked. Someone might accuse another of stealing bread, or say they heard a rumor about infidelity, witchcraft, or stolen cattle. Voices would rise, a bench might tip, a mug might be thrown, and then the alewife would bang her ladle on the table. Once, just once, she dragged a man out by his hair. No one ever talked about it after. In winter, the tavern saved lives. Frost crept in through every crack and the hearth had to be fed constantly. When wood ran low, they burned peat, old crates, sometimes even broken stools. A dog lay curled by the fire, its breath fogging the air. Someone's baby cried softly from the rafters, wrapped in rags. And outside, the snow piled up in silence, as if waiting for something to be forgotten. Inside, the talk never stopped. You learned who had lost what, who'd buried a son, who was owed grain, who might marry, who might die soon. You learned about a lord who'd banned dancing, about a mill that had swallowed a man whole, about a merchant who promised silk and returned with lice. In the corner, someone carved symbols into the wall, runes or nonsense no one knew. On the back of a door, someone else had scratched a prayer, not in Latin. In the kind of crude spelling, that meant it came from the heart. And still the fire burned. Sometimes a guest would arrive in fancier clothes, boots without holes, smelling of lavender. They'd look around with curled lips, ask for a feather bed, order wine. The alewife would serve them last. Or not at all. If they stayed, they changed. If they didn't, no one noticed. Taverns didn't need customers. They needed the right kind of presence. Warm bodies with cold hands and good ears. They ran not on profit, but on pulse. So you sat there on a bench that leaned in a room full of strangers you knew better than your own kin, and you drank cloudy ale by the glow of a fire that never slept. You watched someone doze off into a plate of peas, someone else whisper a confession into their drink, and you wondered, not for the first time, why it was that the places with no doors on the outhouse were the ones where people felt the safest. What did it mean that so many traveled, so far just to feel this kind of ordinary? You never really left a tavern. You drifted out of it. The morning wasn't announced with trumpets or sunbeams. It arrived in the flicker of the hearthlight shrinking, in the sound of the alewife scraping a pan with a piece of stale bread, in the moans of someone with a belly full of old beer and older meat. The warmth of the fire gave way to the brittle cold that waited just beyond the door. Someone always opened it too early. The world beyond was still dark, but the tavern had already begun to die for the day. The rushes were wet now, the hearth just glowing coals, and the talk gone. Silence was the most sacred thing a tavern gave when the mugs had stopped moving. Men rubbed their temples, women adjusted their shawls, someone cursed at the stiffness in their back. Someone else chuckled, remembering nothing but the laughter of the night before, even if they couldn't remember why. And somewhere in the middle of all this, the alewife swept. It wasn't a normal kind of sweeping. She did it with the intensity of someone brushing away not just dirt, but memories. Old bones, spilled stew, a single shoe, dried tears on the floor. She swept it all like it never happened. Her face was unchanged, but her body moved with purpose. No music now, no jokes. This was the part of tavern life no one talked about, its hangover. If you had overstayed, you were noticed. Not scolded, not beaten, just noticed. Her eyes might land on you a bit longer. Her broom might pause near your feet. That was enough. You rose. You thanked her. She didn't respond. Not with words. But you might find the next time you arrived, your seat by the fire was still yours. That was her answer. But for many there was no next time. Some visitors were passing through. Pilgrims, tradesmen, outlaws pretending not to be. The road always called them away. And sometimes the tavern became their last warm place. Old men fell asleep and didn't wake. A boy once walked into the forest after a night here and was never seen again. A girl arrived with bruises and vanished the same night. The tavern held secrets, not dark ones necessarily, just heavy ones, weight that hung from the beams and seeped into the cups. In towns, the tavern was a crossroads. Deals were whispered. Here, hires were made over bread. A marriage promise murmured near the fire was often stronger than anything written in church. If you needed a laborer, you asked here. If you had rumors to sell, you drank them down first. But in villages, the tavern was closer to a second home. There weren't many places where a man could speak freely about the unfairness of taxes, or the uselessness of his lord, or the absurdity of tithes, and still leave with his life. The tavern allowed for grumbling. It allowed for mischief, for complaint, for dreaming. It was where peasants became poets, where widows became queens for a night, and where children learned to fear and love adults in the same breath. What is remarkable is how little these places were recorded. Scrolls didn't speak of them. Clerks didn't tally their laughter. Nobles didn't write letters about the way a stranger's song could silence a room. Even the architecture was temporary. Thatch roofs patched yearly, timber beams replaced only when they cracked under snow. Most of these taverns have long since disappeared. Nothing remains of them except stories, told in other taverns by descendants of those who once slept under soot-blackened ceilings. But if you walked through the countryside today, and the wind shifted just right, you might pass a crumbling foundation or a moss-covered post and swear you hear singing, and maybe the fire is still burning there. Somewhere, maybe, even now, someone's carving their name into a table that no longer exists. In the end, the medieval tavern wasn't just a place to drink. It was the closest thing many people had to freedom. A small square of wood and stone and smoke, where rules bent, hearts opened, and the world paused. If only for a single night. It was never about the ale. It was about being allowed to feel human. And so, the ale ran out. The laughter faded, and the broom finished its final sweep. But tell me, why do you think people still dream about those smoky rooms, even now, hundreds of years later? You step off the muddy road, the hem of your tunic soaked, your hands raw from carrying firewood, and the air stinking faintly of smoked pigs and wet clay. You're not here to drink. Not yet. You're here to watch someone work. And in this medieval town, not far from the edge of a marsh and not close enough to matter to a lord, you find yourself outside the crooked door of a woman who brews ale for a living. Her name doesn't matter to history. Few of them do, but today we'll call her Marta. Marta is an alewife, not just a woman who serves drinks, but one who makes them, who understands heat and yeast the way a healer understands fever and bone. She's up before dawn, barefoot in a sloped room surrounded by heavy smells, damp grain, cracked wood, and the unmistakable tang of yeast in bloom. There's a fire going already, because there has to be. The mash needs boiling. The barley's got to be stirred. The hours demand it. There's no recipe, not written at least. It lives in the back of her mouth, in the way her fingers pinch salt, in the tilt of the bucket when she pours water into grain. She brews by instinct, by feel, by memory, passed down from a mother who probably learned it the same way. The ale isn't for celebration. It's for survival. Water carries death. Ale carries just enough alcohol to kill what the well can't. This is not noble work. There are no ivory cups here. Her equipment is a mix of clay pots, wooden paddles, stone, lids, and her own strength. Brewing ale in the medieval period wasn't dainty. It was brutal, repetitive, exhausting, and almost entirely done by women. Across England, the Low Countries, the Germanic principalities, the brewing of ale, especially for home or small sale, was considered women's work. But don't mistake that phrase for weakness. The medieval alewife had power. She might not be able to vote, she couldn't inherit her husband's land. But in a village of 60, she controlled the drink that everyone depended on. She didn't sell ale from a bar or tap room. She sold it from her doorway, her window, a bench outside her home. If she was successful, she had a corner of the house dedicated to brewing. A hot space full of barrels, soot, flies, and the eternal damp. And yes, she kept a ledger, not the kind a monk might use, not neat lines and gold ink, but a flat slate, a string of knotted twine, or a wax tablet smoothed and scratched, again and again. She kept track of debts, of regulars, of who paid in coin and who paid in favors, firewood, eggs, leather scraps. Sometimes she trusted a man to pay later, sometimes she trusted no one. Local officials tried to regulate her, the assize of ale, those odd little tests that meant a town official might show up, drink her brew and declare it too strong, too weak, or just the wrong price. If she was lucky, He left with a bellyful and gave her the fine with a wink. If not, she was punished for bad measures, fined, publicly scolded, sometimes pilloried, and still she brewed, because people needed ale, and in towns where husbands died of war, plague, or debt, women needed work. Brewing let them stay in their homes, raise children, and, if fortune allowed, save a few coins under the hearthstone. There were whispers, of course. There always are. Alewives were seen as loud, proud, too free, some painted with wild hair, and pointy hats in woodcuts. They were said to shout too much, laugh too easily, cheat their customers, use charms to make the ale ferment faster. It was easy, in a church-led world suspicious of independent women, to paint alewives as halfway to witches. And perhaps in their own quiet way, they were. Not because they cursed or conjured, but because they practiced an alchemy older than medicine and more trusted than priests. They turned water and grain into life, and they did it alone. Some women, like Marta, were barely scraping by. Others became wealthy. In some towns, widows ran alehouses for decades, passing them down to daughters or nieces. They became essential. When grain was scarce, they were the ones who decided which batch would be weaker, which mug cost more, and in the coldest winters, when no one had silver, they still brewed. Their customers were laborers, shepherds, beggars, friars, even the occasional knight. All came to Marta's crooked door for the same reason, not just to drink, but to gather, to warm their bones, to hear news, to laugh for an hour before trudging back to the field, the forge, the stable. And Marta, tired, flower-streaked Marta, would lean out her window, hand them a mug, and mark something with her thumbnail into a strip of wood. At night she swept the floors, boiled her paddles, covered the barrels, fed the children, scraped soot off her hands with ashes, sat in silence, and then she'd begin again. So tell me, by the time Marta had brewed her 50th batch that year, she could judge its quality by sound alone. A good ferment made a soft bubbling, like a distant rain behind thick walls. A bad one hissed or sat in still silence, bloated and angry. And that sound, that simple sound of life growing in a barrel, could be the difference between feeding her children or begging flour from the parish priest. Because brewing wasn't just craft. It was a business, and the church didn't like businesses run by women. Neither did many of the men in town, unless they were thirsty. Marta walked a thin line every day, and that line was shaped not by brewing temperatures or grain availability, but by regulation. The assize of ale governed everything. It wasn't just a law, it was a series of controls, taxes, and public expectations that dated back to the 13th century and lasted into the early modern period. Officials called ale tasters, or ale conners, had the job of tasting and testing batches of ale brewed for sale. They weren't just there to enjoy a free drink. They determined if the ale met quality, price, and quantity standards set by the local manor or borough court. These ale tasters could be anyone, a neighbor, a reeve, sometimes even a rival. They arrived unannounced, knocked with authority, walked straight into the brew room, took a ladle of ale, slurped it in silence, and pronounced judgment. Marta watched their lips carefully. Did they smack them after sipping? Did they nod? Were they waiting for a bribe? Because the next words mattered. Too strong. Too weak. Improper measure. Any of those could result in a fine, entered into the town rolls, read aloud at the next moot. Marta's name spoken in judgment, her debts listed, her character questioned, all for a brew that had simply settled longer in a cool corner of the kitchen. And the irony was bitter. These men often lacked any brewing skill. They judged based on tradition, rumor, or whatever mood they happened to be in that day. Still, Marta adapted. She learned to adjust the grain bill, learned how to water down a batch just enough to pass inspection, while keeping a stronger batch tucked away for regulars. She brewed in smaller pots when grain prices rose, and added wood shavings to her fire to stretch the boil time. She had, too. The taxes didn't wait. The town charged for the right to sell ale. Called ale licenses, these were fees assessed annually or seasonally. Some towns charged a flat rate, others by the number of batches. Some required bribes, others took grain in trade. Marta kept a pouch hidden beneath the floorboards, its string worn thin by worried fingers. That pouch held the difference between freedom and shame, because if she couldn't pay the tax, she didn't just lose her trade. She could be pilloried. Yes, Marta, just like many real women of her time, faced public punishment. The pillory wasn't just for thieves. It was for bad ale. A batch too thin, too expensive, or brewed without permission. The town would drag the offender to the marketplace and strap her neck and wrists into the wooden frame. The punishment wasn't physical. It was social. People would walk by. Some spat. Some jeered. A few may have pitied her. But her name was now known. A poor brewer, a liar, a cheat. Even if her ale had been fine, even if the taster was corrupt, even if her only crime was brewing one pot too many to pay for her daughter's shoes, and still, she brewed. Because what else could she do inside? Towns and villages alike, widows and wives turned to brewing not for joy but for stability. It was one of the only forms of income they could manage from home, especially when caring for children, sick parents, or wounded husbands. For many women like Marta, brewing was passed down generationally, not as a legacy, but as a necessity, and that made the ledger so important. She might use chalk marks on a wall, or notches on a stick, each one marking a pint owed. Some used ropes with knots, each knot a customer. Others scratched into wax tablets they reused each week. These systems had to be clear to her, but confusing to thieves, because there were always those who drank more than they paid for. So she watched the drinkers, their hands, their eyes. She listened to their stories, not for interest, but for patterns. Did a man suddenly show up with silver after months of debt? Did a neighbor bring eggs from hens he didn't own? These were signs. Brewing wasn't just labor, it was surveillance. Some alewives hired help. Daughters, nieces, even other widows. Brewing was communal. Buckets too heavy for one woman were lifted together. Stirring the mash required arms that wouldn't give out halfway through. And laughter, real, gutter-deep laughter, sometimes filled the space, rising above the steam and smoke. Not joy exactly, but defiance. Marta didn't know she was part of history. She only knew that if she failed, the tavern would go silent, the hearth would go cold, and the field hands would grumble as they drank rainwater again. So she stirred, brewed and served with the kind of practiced attention that went unnoticed by every monk, scribe, and noble, but not by the people who counted. The ones who came to her window in the rain handed her a muddy coin and muttered, "Your last batch was the best I've tasted all year." She didn't smile. She just scratched a mark on the stick. But what happened when the church began to link alewives with something more sinister, something almost magical? The line between brewer and witch was thinner than steam. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, as the church tightened its grip and literacy spread among the ruling classes, a dangerous curiosity began to rise. Curiosity about how things here worked, and more dangerously, who worked them. And so women like Marta, alewives with hands steeped in boiling wort and soot, found their craft being eyed with growing suspicion. After all, what else could explain a woman who made something from nothing? Who sold warmth, laughter, and intoxication from her window, while men toiled in fields and could not do the same? The answer, some whispered, was witchcraft. They began to notice things. How she stirred her mash counterclockwise when the moon was low. How she burned juniper by the hearth, supposedly to drive off flies. How she muttered to herself as she counted knots on her ale rope. And how now and then a batch turned bitter without explanation. They said the yeast was too lively. They said her beer made men dream. They said her smile lingered longer than it should. Across Europe, this new unease twisted itself into stories, then images, then accusations. In England and the Low Countries, church sermons began to mention the alewife alongside warnings of vanity, excess, and sin. Moralists painted her with a pointed hat, a symbol of pride, a broom because she always kept the brewing area clean, a cat because cats chased the rats who loved barley. It all made sense, until it didn't. The broom became her flight stick, the cat her familiar, the cauldron her spell pot. Never mind that the cauldron was a basic mash tun, that the pointed hat was a common wool cap worn while standing over steaming pots, that the cat was a working animal in pest-infested cottages. Marta didn't change, but the way she was seen did, and so she adapted again. She removed the broom from view. She no longer dried herbs in her doorway. She stopped singing while brewing, just in case someone heard. The tragedy was not just suspicion, it was replacement. As towns grew and wealth consolidated, brewing shifted away from homes and into guilds. Male-dominated, tightly controlled, and increasingly commercial, these brewing guilds began to edge women out. In some cities, laws were passed barring women from brewing in large quantities. In others, taxes became so burdensome that home brewers couldn't compete with guild brewers. A handful of powerful men could make 100 barrels a month. Marta made 5. The math decided the future, and yet for a time she endured, because the poor didn't drink guild ale. They couldn't afford it. They drank Marta's cloudy, unpredictable, nourishing brew, sweet when the barley had been smoked, sour when the fermentation went too far, always warm from her hands and hearth. And for many that mattered more because they didn't just buy ale from her. They bought memory, connection, ritual. They saw her cracked hands and soot-streaked sleeves and recognized something of themselves. Sometimes they brought her gifts, a chicken with a broken foot, a loaf baked in someone else's oven, a charm carved into bone to ward off illness. She kept them all, not for value but because no one else would. The ledger grew quieter. Her children moved away, some to towns, others to fields, one into a cloister. She taught a niece to brew, then a neighbor's daughter. Her last batch was smaller, simpler, just for the road workers, just enough. And one day, the ale taster didn't come, not because she was beyond inspection, but because she no longer mattered to the tax rolls. Her name slipped from the register. Her stick of debts was burned with firewood. Her mash tun was sold. Her paddles split for kindling. The neighbors drank water again, until someone younger tried their hand with a batch in. A bucket martyr died with no title, no will, no monument, but for a generation of workers, shepherds, widows, midwives, and outcasts, her doorway was church and commons and comfort. You can find her now, if you look carefully. In 15th century woodcuts, she's the woman in the background, barefoot, stirring a pot. In manor court records, she's the brewer fined for improper measure. In folk tales, she's the woman who cursed the harvest or healed a cough or both. And in every forgotten village, just beyond the edge of the records, she was the woman who kept people warm in the belly and the heart. So the next time someone says history belongs to kings and popes, remind them that without the alewife, most people would have never made it to morning. You wouldn't know his name. That's how it's always been. The travelling tinker came and went like bad weather. Expected, muttered about, and never quite remembered. But for a few hours, maybe a night, he was the most useful man in town. He walked with a bundle on his back, wrapped in an oilcloth that glistened like fish scales after rain. Clanging metal poked out of every fold. Pots, hinges, a length of chain, spoons bent into hooks, a rusted knife sharpener, a ladle made from something that used to be a pan. Nothing matched. Everything made noise. The sound of his arrival was a kind of soft thunder, the clinking, clattering, scraping harmony of a life carried in parts. He didn't own a cart, couldn't afford the tax on wheels. Instead, his boots were patched with leather from 5 different animals, his hat was stitched from old cloaks, and his fingers were scorched from years of mending what the world forgot how to fix. The medieval tinker wasn't a craftsman in the usual sense. He didn't build. He didn't forge from raw ore. He moved day after day from village to hamlet, repairing the daily debris of medieval life. A cracked pot, a leaky kettle, a broken clasp, hinges that screamed when they moved, if they moved at all. His job wasn't to create beauty, it was to delay decay. In a world where everything cost more than it was worth, his skill was priceless, and so you'd hear his arrival before you saw him. He'd knock gently on the post outside the inn, or tap a crooked spoon against a crooked pan. "Tinker, come," he'd call in a sing-song voice. "Iron-mended, copper-soldered, edges ground." Sometimes he added, "No questions, no sermons." That part mattered, because tinkers lived outside the lines of society. They weren't guild members, weren't tied to a lord or manor. They had no parish, no tithe to pay, no land to till, and that made people uneasy. A man with no roots could not be trusted, but they needed him. So he stayed. One day, maybe 2. He'd sit on a low stool near the fire or under an open shed and begin to work, tools laid out like relics, charcoal fire burning low, bellows wheezing. You'd hand him your broken shears and he'd nod, make no promises and begin. The repairs were fast, ugly sometimes, but they worked. A rivet here, a patch of pewter, solder that smoked and sizzled. He carried strips of lead, coils of wire, crumpled bits of tin, nothing new, all salvaged. His hands smelled of ash and vinegar, his breath of onions and ale. People gathered. Children stared at the sparks. Men watched, trying to learn, never quite succeeding. Women pointed to old pots and asked, "One more year?" He'd nod if he could, shrug if he couldn't. The truth was simple, he didn't know until he tried. He was paid in coin when there was coin. In bread, cheese, old wool, or a bed of straw when there wasn't. Sometimes just in words. "Come back next year. The kettles. Yours again." He didn't argue, didn't complain. He wasn't allowed to stay long anyway. The law viewed tinkers with suspicion, so did the church. They moved from town to town, crossed borders without permits, spoke with strange accents, and refused to kneel for prayers unless pressed. They knew too much and too little. They heard gossip in one village and shared it in the next. They were living letters, walking messengers, and when something went missing after a tinker's visit, people whispered. Still, when the millstone cracked or the hearth bellows broke, who else could help? The tinker was repair in a world built for rot. He didn't sleep indoors, usually found a stable or the lee side of a pigsty, wrapped his oilcloth tight and curled beside his tools. Dogs knew better than to bark at him. Cats sometimes shared his warmth. He kept no family, or if he did, no one knew where they were. Some said the tinkers lived in a secret village in the hills, where broken pots hung from trees and no one had to pray. Others said they were cursed smiths, banished from guilds for forging swords too sharp for kings. A few thought they were part magician. How else could a man fix a copper basin with only a file and spit? He never answered those stories. In the morning he left quietly, never before dawn, never after breakfast. A few coins in his pouch, a crust of bread in his coat, the clatter of his pack like a fading lullaby. By the time the village children found the spot where he slept, he was already hours down the road. And yet, somehow he always came back. When your only trade is repair, you're always needed eventually. But what happens when even the things you repair are no longer worth saving? By the time a tinker reached your village again, weeks, sometimes months later, he could tell what had changed before a single word was spoken. A new wall here, a grave marker there, fewer children in the road, a woman gone, a baby added, a donkey limping. The patterns of breakage told him everything he needed to know, and the work was never the same. This time it might be hinges and candle molds. Next time, buckets and pewter cups. He carried no inventory list, no client book, no parchment of receipts, just memory. And that memory had to hold not only who owed him 3 boiled eggs last spring, but also which pan had cracked near the base and which lid needed a new handle carved from bone. That was another thing he did. Improvisation. Tinkers didn't just mend, they repurposed. A broken spoon became a clasp. A bent nail became a toothpick or a hinge pin. Broken knives were filed into short blades. Bits of chain could be melted down and reshaped into pot handles or strap loops or binding rings. The goal wasn't to make something beautiful. It was to make it useful again. For one more season, one more journey, one more hard winter, and people clung to those extensions like lifelines. In a world where everything was expensive and almost nothing was replaceable, the line between broken and useless was philosophical. Tinkers occupied that line, carrying heat and noise and smoke and metal with them, quietly whispering, "Not yet, not quite done." But not everything could be mended. When a pot was cracked wide open, when a blade had snapped at the hilt, when the rust ran deeper than the tin, the tinker would shake his head slowly. That shake carried weight. It wasn't just a no, it was a kind of burial, a quiet admission that some things had passed beyond saving. Some villagers wept, because the loss of a kettle wasn't just the loss of a tool. It was the loss of years of shared meals. A blade might have belonged to a father. A ladle might have stirred 10 children's stews. Tinkers didn't just mend objects, they mended emotional timelines. And when they couldn't, silence filled. The gaps. Sometimes he was blamed. "It worked before you touched it," someone would mutter. He didn't argue. He packed his tools, walked on. The road was hard on a man, especially one who slept in hedgerows and ate what he was given. Many tinkers lost toes to frostbite, fingers to burn, teeth to rot. They smelled like smoke and river water and were rarely allowed in a church, not because they were evil, but because they didn't belong. They floated between spaces, half ghost, half gear. In border towns, they were questioned, asked for proof of trade. In bigger cities, they were denied entrance altogether. "We've got our own smiths," they were told, even when they didn't. So he stuck to the back lanes, the weedy tracks between crumbled Roman roads. He followed rivers until they disappeared, slept under bridges, sat on stones warmed by cow dung. He watched how villages changed. Stone replaced wood, paved lanes replaced muddy ruts. People threw away cracked pots instead of mending them. New things, cheap things, came in carts from far-off towns, and the villagers said, "No need for the tinker this year." But sometimes, just sometimes, someone would call out. A girl would run from a cottage with a tin cup that used to be her mother's. A shepherd would hold out a broken clasp with no words. An old woman would say, "You fixed this before. Could you do it again?" And he would nod, sit down, unwrap the bundle, light a fire, the same tools, the same motions, the same slow magic of resistance, because that's what tinkers were. Resistance embodied, resistance to replacement, resistance to forgetting, resistance to the slow and quiet death of the handmade, the handed down, the held on to. At night, he'd sometimes hum a tune no one knew, a melody scraped from old bones and fire. His hands smelled of metal, his breath of yesterday's onions, his boots of every field he'd ever crossed. He didn't know where he was going next, but he knew he wasn't finished yet. Still, what happens when the world decides it no longer wants what you offer? There was no farewell party, no final contract, no gravestone carved with "Here lies the last tinker." When the age of the tinker ended, it didn't collapse with noise. It faded, quietly like smoke that thins into nothing. One day the road was just emptier. The jingling bundle of spoons and scrap iron no longer echoed in the lanes. The kettle by the hearth cracked and stayed cracked. The lid was never soldered. The hinge never replaced. And people stopped waiting by the gate when they heard footsteps coming from the woods. But before that final silence, there was still one more night. Somewhere in a valley forgotten by newer trade routes, a tinker sat beneath a willow tree. He was older now, bent. The fingers that once twisted iron like string now trembled slightly when he worked. His hearing had dulled, but he still listened. To the wind, to the hiss of steam from a copper pot, to the soft murmur of a village half asleep beyond the fields. He woke up one morning in 1327 with the sun creeping through the shutters, the rooster crowing behind someone's fence, and your hands itching. Not just itching, burning, tingling, the kind of sensation that made you wonder if ants had crawled beneath your skin during the night. Your feet felt strange too, stiff, not from walking, not from cold, just not yours. Then the shaking started. You weren't alone. Half the village was outside already, stumbling, laughing, shouting nonsense into the morning fog. An old man danced until he collapsed. A child spoke in perfect Latin, then fainted. A mother began to scream at the dirt like it had insulted her. People dropped to the ground in convulsions. Some never got back up. No one knew what was happening, and none suspected the bread, because bread was everything in 1327. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. If you were poor, it was 70% of your daily calories. Rye bread, mostly, cheaper than wheat, more resistant to cold and able to grow in miserable fields. It was dense, heavy, sour, baked in communal ovens with no markings, no brands, no date stamps. You ate it without question, because not eating it meant death. But rye, left in a damp cellar, especially after a rainy season, can become something else, something dangerous, something poisonous. You wouldn't know the name, but modern science does. Claviceps purpurea, a fungus, a parasite. It lives on rye grain and produces toxic alkaloids. When you eat it, you're eating a hallucinogen, a vasoconstrictor, a neurotoxin, all rolled into one. Today we call it ergot. Back then they called it St. Anthony's fire, or just a curse. No one suspected the food. After all, the bread looked fine. A little darker, maybe. A little sourer. But wasn't that how rye was supposed to taste? People were grateful to eat at all. Symptoms varied. Some people trembled. Others went rigid. Some hallucinated. Others vomited or bled from their noses. Some lost limbs to gangrene. Their fingers turned black. Their toes curled like burned paper. And still, no one thought to blame the loaf on the table. Instead, they blamed God or the devil or witches or the air. In some places, they held processions, dragging sick children through the streets in hopes of divine mercy. In others, they isolated families thinking they were contagious, and sometimes they just waited and watched and hoped that next week's bread would be better. The disease struck hardest when people were desperate, after wet springs, after failed harvests, when grain supplies ran low and peasants scraped the bottom of the barrel, literally, the oldest rye, the dampest sacks, the mouldiest bits, ground and baked into loaves because the alternative was starvation. No one knew how long the effects would last. For some it was a day of misery. For others, weeks of blinding pain, feet that burned, limbs that curled, skin that peeled in strange patterns, jaws that clenched shut, eyes that saw things that weren't there, saints, demons, angels dancing, on rooftops, and then sometimes death. But the body wasn't the only thing at risk. Entire communities could spiral. One outbreak in a German town left dozens dead, others dancing uncontrollably in the streets until they collapsed. In France, whole villages fell into trance-like states. In certain records, chroniclers write of mass madness, songs that never ended, processions of people foaming at the mouth, towns too terrified to eat their own grain. No one knew it was the bread, because no one had ever questioned bread. It was sacred. In religious rituals, in daily life, in taxes, in famine. It was the line between survival and oblivion, and to question the bread was to question the very structure of life. So they blamed the baker, the weather, the millstone, the stars, and yet every meal they returned to the loaf. What does it mean when the thing that feeds you is the thing that's slowly killing you? The smell of fresh bread in the 14th century was rarely sweet. It was sour, tangy, slightly burnt, with an undertone of ash or even mildew, especially if the oven hadn't been fully cleaned, which it usually hadn't. But when it was your loaf, cooling beside your hearth on a flat stone or wrapped in an old cloth, it didn't matter how it smelled. It was food. You ate it, you fed it to your children. You said grace before swallowing and hoped it would keep you strong. But after a bad harvest, after rain spoiled the grain stores and rats got into the flour sacks, the loaves came out wrong, and not all bakers were blind to it. In towns across Europe, particularly where rye was common and the poor outnumbered the wealthy 5 to 1, a few bakers began to notice patterns. Those dark, grainy seeds with a purple sheen, heavier, more brittle, shouldn't be there. Some tried to sort them out. Others didn't. There were no microscopes, no chemistry, no germ theory. But what they did have was experience passed down from masters to apprentices. Bakers knew grain. They knew what cracked too early, what smelled wrong when ground, what dough felt too thin. And some of them quietly began to fear their own product. But they couldn't stop baking because bread wasn't just sustenance. It was currency. In many towns, bakers were legally bound to bake for the community. Refusing to do so could result in punishment. They couldn't price their bread freely. The weight and cost of a loaf was set by the local assize of bread, a regulation that allowed lords and bailiffs to inspect and punish bakers for shorting their loaves or overcharging. So even if your flour was half spoiled, you still had to bake the bread, even if it made people sick. And when people did fall ill, when the villagers began to lose toes, when the butcher's apprentice screamed all night from crawling pains in his legs, when the priest began to tremble, mid-sermon, the fingers started to point at the baker, at the grain merchant, at the miller who hadn't cleaned his stones. Punishments varied: fines, pillories, public shaming. One baker in a Flemish village was dragged through the streets, with his loaves tied around his neck, each one burned black and marked with a red cross in paint. Another was forced to kneel at the altar and confess his sin of negligence in front of a crowd of coughing, trembling villagers. But most of them kept baking, because the line between accident and murder was thin and poorly lit. And because hunger was louder than suspicion, the church, ever ready to offer an explanation, linked the outbreaks to moral failure. Bread was sacred. It represented the body of Christ. To be sickened by it meant there was sin in the village. Someone had strayed, someone had lied, someone had stolen, and now the punishment had arrived not by sword or plague, but by the loaf itself. In some towns, the outbreaks were interpreted as divine cleansing. People were encouraged to fast, to avoid unclean grains, but they didn't know what made a grain unclean. No one did. The language around food was symbolic, not scientific. Mold was corruption. Spoilage was moral decay. A child who hallucinated was said to be touched by spirits. A man whose fingers blackened and fell off was believed to be marked by pride. And still the ovens burned. Still the bakers swept their stones. Still the millers ground their tainted rye, knowing that questioning the grain supply meant questioning the entire agricultural cycle. A threat to bread was a threat to everything. In a few regions, priests and monks tried to intervene. They would bless the ovens, sprinkle holy water over flour, encourage villagers to leave loaves at altars overnight. But nothing stopped the rot, because the rot wasn't spiritual. It was chemical, and it was merciless. Outbreaks of ergotism could last for years. In some areas, it returned with every bad season. In wetter climates, it lingered like a ghost. And those who survived carried the scars for life. Blackened stumps where toes used to be, twisted hands, faces frozen in tremors, voices that slurred even when sober. And then there were the dreams. Many who lived through it described visions. That never left. Saints whose faces blurred into fire, walls that bled, horses with golden eyes. Children heard music that no one else could hear. One woman claimed she saw God's shadow move across her ceiling for 9 nights straight. Some never truly returned, but the bread was never blamed, not directly, not officially, not in writing, because bread was too sacred, too necessary, too central. To question bread was to unravel the world. So what did people do? They kept baking, kept eating, kept hoping the next batch would be kinder. And when the grain finally ran clean again after a dry season, after a better harvest, people rejoiced not in health, but in normalcy. No more dreams, no more twitching hands, just the familiar ache of hunger and work. But how do you sleep, knowing that the next bite might turn your blood into fire? In the aftermath of an ergot outbreak, the village was quieter. Not because things were fixed, but because people didn't have the strength to keep talking about it. The baker still baked, the miller still ground the rye, but something lingered behind the walls, an unease, a shared bruise in memory that never quite healed. And still no one wrote the word poison. Instead, they recorded miracles, because what do you call it when a woman convulses for 6 hours and then wakes claiming she saw the Virgin Mary weeping at the edge of her bed? What do you call it when a child, after weeks of fevers and visions, suddenly stands and recites a psalm he never learned? You call it divine. You build a shrine, you leave offerings, you name it a holy event. And all across Europe, that's exactly what they did. Small towns that had suffered outbreaks sometimes became pilgrimage sites. People would come to touch the stone where a man's seizures had opened his eyes to heaven. Others would drink from the well near the bakery where a girl stopped screaming. Church leaders encouraged the stories. They needed them, needed a way to explain the suffering without indicting the bread, or the system that fed them all. And so bread remained sacred, untouchable, even when people died from it. Those who survived often bore physical reminders: charred-looking fingers, missing toes, clubbed hands. These people, the burnt ones, were seen with a mixture of pity and awe. Some became hermits, others wandered. A few took to silence altogether, as if words might reopen the wounds. The bakers changed too. Some abandoned the trade, sold their ovens, took up cobbling or cart repair, anything less vital. Others doubled down, baking only in winter when grain. Stores were more stable or refusing to buy rye from certain mills. But it wasn't enough. The fungus was invisible, persistent, random. It struck not through malice, but through indifference. And so time, as it always does, swept the memory into shadows. Generations passed. Ergot was not named. No monk gave it a Latin term. No physician prescribed a cure. It disappeared into the background of history like smoke through thatched roofs, but its shape lingered in stories. A 15th century woodcut shows a man with twisted legs dancing under the moon. It's labeled Merry Madness. A folk song in the Alps tells of a girl who sings too long, sleeps too deep, and returns without her memory. In Brittany, a small chapel bears a carved loaf above its door, blackened, cracked, and never explained. Only much later, centuries later, with microscopes and chemistry and reluctant hindsight, did we realize what had happened, that the great plagues of bread were not curses, not divine, not magical, just a fungus, a parasite, living quietly in the damp folds of the food we depended on most. And maybe that's the strangest cruelty of all, because we can understand disease carried by rats. We can curse fleas. We can blame wells or winds or strangers at the gate. But poisoned bread. Bread is trust. Bread is life. Bread is safety. To learn that the thing you kneaded with your own hands, that you fed your child, that you gave thanks for in prayer, was the thing that burned your blood and twisted your limbs. That knowledge was too much. So it was buried. As the world moved on, today we see the signs in the soil, in grain records, in hospital entries from monasteries, in skulls with jawbones warped by chronic tension. But in their time there were no names, just shaking and fear, and the slow silence of people too afraid to ever question their next bite. No one remembers the name of the man who carried a letter from Paris to Bruges in the spring of 1312. But somewhere, tucked in a bundle of royal decrees or merchant accounts, was a folded scrap of parchment, sealed with wax, bound with twine, and trusted to a single man on a single horse. He wasn't a knight, he wasn't even a soldier. He was a messenger, and his entire purpose was to be forgotten. You might think of him as a courier, but the work was stranger than that. He rode alone, carrying words that were not his, on roads that were barely roads at all. Paths of mud, gravel, and wild grass. Tracks where wolves outnumbered fellow travelers. He knew every turn of every tree line between abbeys, manors, and port towns, not because he wanted to, but because his life depended on it. There were no maps. There were no inns. There were only distances measured in aching knees and bruised tailbones and time. Not just the passage of time, but the weight of it. Because everything he carried had a deadline. It didn't matter whether it was a royal missive or a miller's grain invoice. Every letter was urgent, because every delay could mean famine, war, or betrayal. The parchment was rough. Ink bled through the fibers. Wax seals melted slightly. In the summer heat and cracked in winter. The strings frayed. And yet these fragile bundles of symbols carried decisions that changed lives. Marriage proposals, land claims, summonses to court, secret codes sent during siege. And if that letter didn't arrive, sometimes people died. So the messenger rode. His horse wasn't bred for war, it was built for endurance. Stocky, thick-bellied, sure-footed on mud and gravel. It carried him through rivers, across low stone bridges, through the stink of swamp, fog, and down into valleys where no sound followed except the snort of its nostrils. He wore no armor. Just a wool cloak, boots stiff with mud, and gloves patched with whatever leather could be salvaged. His only weapons were a short dagger and the fact that most people ignored him, because he wasn't a threat. He was a tool, and the world, for the most part, left tools alone, but the dangers were real. Robbers didn't care what was in the saddlebag, they cared that the man rode alone. A single traveler was a target. A messenger with the king's crest was a target with a price. He might carry false letters in an outer pouch and hide the real message sewn into his clothing. Sometimes he traveled with forged papers in case he was stopped at a town gate. Sometimes he memorized the letter and burned the original. He had to plan for every kind of failure, because no one would rescue him, and no one would remember him. He ate dried bread and smoked fish, drank from rivers when they were clean, slept with the horse's reins tied around his ankle. If he broke a leg, there was no one to take the letter the rest of the way. If he froze, the parchment froze with him, and he knew that if he disappeared, the response from the recipient would not be grief, but impatience. The letter never came. That was the closest thing to a eulogy he'd ever get. He passed through towns but never stayed. Messengers weren't welcome. They brought news, and news brought change, and most people feared both. A royal seal meant taxes. A red wax stamp meant someone had died. A merchant's mark meant new prices, new rules, new debts. People watched him ride in silence. The letters were wrapped in oiled cloth tucked into a pouch lined with wool. They might include receipts, edicts, treaties, or just a single line hastily scrawled by candlelight. The harvest has failed. Send grain. Quickly. He never read them. That wasn't his place. But he knew the weight of grief, of desperation, of fear, because he carried them every day. Sometimes he arrived to find that the recipient had already died, or that the village had been burned, or that the war had moved on and the king's men no longer waited at the appointed castle. And still he delivered the letter. He would find someone, anyone, a priest, a widow, a boy. He would press the sealed parchment into their hand and say the same thing he always said. This was meant for you. And then he would turn, mount his horse and ride into the distance, dust in his wake, silence in his ears. But what happens when a message arrives too late and the truth it carries no longer matters? You might imagine that the medieval messenger had a clear path, a known route, a schedule, but most of the time he didn't. There were no milestones etched into stone for his benefit, no mile markers, no road signs. Instead, he followed the land itself, a particular bend in a stream, a ruined abbey overgrown with moss, a tree that had once been split by lightning. These were his coordinates, soft landmarks carved into the brain, not the earth. And when a path was washed away, or a bridge collapsed, or a village he once relied on for shelter was now empty and rotting, he didn't stop. He detoured. That could mean hours through forests so thick the horse could barely walk. Days navigating valleys of ice and snow with no fires allowed, because smoke could give him away. At every turn, the letter in his pouch got heavier, not physically, but with expectation, because every hour it was delayed, its meaning began to shift. A promise made too late becomes an apology. An order not followed becomes insubordination. A message of peace delivered after the swords have already drawn blood becomes a mockery. and the messenger carried all that weight in silence. He wasn't allowed to explain, wasn't supposed to speak beyond, "I was sent." He didn't get to plead for understanding when a seal was cracked by rain or a name smudged by sweat. He just handed over the message and braced for the reaction. Sometimes he was thanked, sometimes spat at, sometimes struck. A noble once had a messenger whipped for delivering news that his daughter's betrothal had been broken, not because the messenger was at fault, but because he was the one holding the truth. And in a world where messages traveled on horseback, the messenger was the message. But worse than rage was apathy. He might ride for days through hail and wind to deliver a letter only to be told that no longer concerns us. The man who wrote it, dead. The plan it outlined, abandoned. The goods it referenced, spoiled. The letter was now just a scrap of parchment. He'd carried it like a sacred burden, and now it was nothing. Used to light a candle or wrap a salted herring. He didn't argue, just turned and rode on. Most messengers were lowborn. The job paid a pittance. A few deniers here, a bowl of stew there. Some were employed by royal courts, others by wealthy merchants, monasteries, or regional bishops. But few had status, few had safety. They were sometimes granted a token, a carved piece of wood, a wax medallion, a ring with a seal, meant to prove their legitimacy if questioned. But not all questioning ended peacefully. A lone man with an unknown insignia could be accused of espionage. Could be arrested, could vanish. That's why some messages were sent in pairs, two riders taking different routes, hoping at least one would make it. Others were sent with deliberate errors in case the letter was intercepted. The real meaning could be hidden behind a code, a symbol, a line written in lemon juice and only visible with heat. The messenger never knew, couldn't know. He was the carrier, not the keeper. In this way, his life became a sequence of missions with no memory. He didn't get to know whether the grain arrived in time to stop the famine, whether the truce held, whether the apology was accepted. He just rode, alone, with words that were never his, and the only consistent sound in his world was the breath of the horse beneath him, rhythmic, steady, living. The one soul who kept him warm in winter, moving in fog, standing in streams while he filled his hands with cold water and prayed the saddle wouldn't split. He slept beside it, spoke to it when no one else listened, and mourned it quietly when one finally collapsed from exhaustion and had to be left behind, because messengers didn't stop riding just because a friend had fallen. Not when the message still had breath in it. But what happens when the rider begins to forget his own name and only remembers the names in the letters? Somewhere along the 8th road out of York, in a hollow between two quiet hills, the messenger stopped remembering his own name, not all at once. It began when he was addressed only as courier, rider, boy, or you. Then his last name faded, too seldom spoken. Then the place of his birth blurred, replaced by the names he read on seals and scrolls. De Warenne, Montfort, de Clare. Men whose titles were louder than any peasant's first breath. Men who would live in letters long after bones decayed. But the messenger? He passed from town to town, parchment to parchment, until the only names that remained were not his, but those he carried. And yet, he remembered every route. The low road past the moor with the bent pine. The bridge where the boards creaked in. Sequence, 1, 2, 3, pause. The monk in Darlington who would offer boiled milk, and the widow near Ely who once patched his glove with a thread pulled from her hem. These became his world markers. They mattered more than the year, the king, or the shifting borders, because the messenger was not a man of news. He was a man of certainty. And in a world of rumor, uprising, and sickness, people needed someone who arrived when he said he would, holding something that hadn't changed along the way. That was his power, his curse. He bore truth, even when it hurt. He delivered news of sons dead in battle, land seized, marriages denied, monks excommunicated. He watched as noblewomen folded their hands to hide their shaking, saw scribes go pale, saw old men sigh and say, "Well then," and he turned around and rode again. He was not thanked, not truly, because in the medieval world, the messenger was invisible the moment he was no longer needed. If he was injured, he was patched, not healed. If he was tired, he was given food, not rest. If he died en route, another was hired. The road did not wait, and so he grew quieter, not just with others, but inside himself. The part that once sang while riding now counted hoofbeats. The part that once dreamed now rehearsed names, dates, deliveries. He repeated the words of the messages to himself, over and over, like a monk chanting psalms, not because he believed them, but because forgetting them could mean the end of a kingdom. In time, he developed habits. He pressed the wax seals 3 times before departure. He tapped his saddlebag once every mile. He tied his cloak at the same knot every time for luck. Superstition, yes, but when you ride alone through wilderness with nothing but someone else's words in your pouch, luck becomes as real as breath, and the longer he rode, the more the world passed him by. He saw castles built where fields once stood, forests cut into roads, old villages renamed, towns he once visited reduced to cinders by war or plague or a lord's ambition. He passed a ruin once where he delivered a letter 15 years earlier, announcing the birth of a noble heir. Now, only a broken arch remained. And that heir, long dead in France, cut down in a skirmish that never made it to parchment, and the letter he'd carried, its only echo now was dust, but still he rode, until one day, deep into his 40s, a merchant's clerk asked him his name for the ledger. The messenger hesitated, and for a moment couldn't recall, not because he had forgotten entirely, but because it had been so long since anyone had asked. Eventually, he gave a name. Perhaps it was his, perhaps not. It didn't matter. The clerk just nodded and dipped his quill. Because what mattered was that the letter had arrived. In the end, the messenger became a kind of ghost, not dead, not living in full, just moving, from one task to the next, from border to border, from voice to silence. And maybe that was enough, because for all the kings who never opened their own letters, for all the nobles who never noticed who stood at their gates, there was still someone, somewhere, who waited for a reply, and the puis. Messenger? He carried that too. Even when the road no longer remembered his footsteps, even when the horse beneath him grew old and slow, even when the ink on the scroll had faded into brown whispers, he rode on. Because in a world where nothing lasted, someone had to carry the words. The sound came first. A low, hollow thud, repeating at regular intervals, like a heartbeat, if the heart belonged to a machine made of wood, stone, and wet rags. You could hear it from the edge of the village, constant, relentless. It meant one thing: the fulling. Mill was awake, and so were the men and boys inside it. You wouldn't mistake the building for anything else. A low, damp structure tucked near the stream, its roof dark with moss, the air around it heavy with moisture and rot. It smelled of wet wool, piss, crushed leaves, and time. Always time, because inside this place, the work didn't stop. Not for weather, not for feast days, not even for funerals unless the corpse was your own. The job was called fulling, and it was one of the dirtiest, most exhausting and most vital roles in the medieval wool industry. Wool, after shearing, spinning, and weaving, was still greasy, loose and uneven. It needed to be cleaned, thickened, and shaped into the kind of cloth that could be worn, dyed, or traded. That was the fuller's task, and to do it, he needed two things: a mill and a kind of patience that bordered on numbness. In earlier centuries, fulling was done by foot. Yes, literally stomping the cloth in a vat of urine and water, sometimes mixed with fuller's earth or lye. Workers would strip to the waist, or completely naked, and spend hours pressing, kneading, and pounding bundles of wool cloth with their bare feet. It was called walking the cloth. The ammonia in urine helped dissolve the natural lanolin, oils. The process was exhausting, slippery, and blistering. It led to infections, skin rot, boils between the toes. But it worked, and when water-powered fulling mills came into use in the 12th and 13th centuries, the work changed, but didn't get easier. Now the hammer did the stomping. The mill used a water wheel to power wooden hammers or pestles that rhythmically beat down on the cloth in a shallow trough. Over and over, thud, 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 for hours, for days, depending on the batch. Men still had to position and rotate the fabric, still had to soak it, still had to clean the troughs, clear the blockages, grease the gears, and in winter, the water froze your joints. In summer, the stench turned your stomach. There was no silence, only the thudding, and the fullers learned to live with it until they didn't. Some said the sound drove men mad, that if you stood too close for too long, your dreams began to match its rhythm. That once you heard the hammer in your bones, you could never be truly still again. Others just went deaf. There were no earplugs. No safety rails, no gloves, just wool soaked in piss, crushed between your fingers until your knuckles swelled. Just steam rising from vats that never emptied. Just the black mold that crept up the walls and down into your chest. And all of it, for one goal: to make the wool merchant rich. Because while fullers broke their backs by the river, the dyed and finished cloth would travel to markets in Bruges, Rouen, and Milan, sold by weight. Prized for thickness, bragged about by lords and tailors. No one asked who had soaked it, no one cared whose foot had bled on the hem. But the cloth, it remembered. You could tell a rushed batch from a good one by the feel. The best had the fullers. Mark, not visible but tactile. The slight compression at the edges, the grain of the hammer's press, a kind of density born only from suffering. And so the work went on. Boys were apprenticed at 10. Most didn't last long. Their hands blistered, their lungs burned. The hammer made them flinch in their sleep, but those who stayed, they stopped flinching. They became silent, heavy, reliable. You didn't hear much from a fulling mill worker, but you always knew when he passed you in the street, because he smelled like ammonia and mold. Because his hands looked older than his face. Because he didn't blink when the church bell rang, too used to louder rhythms, and when he died there was no marker. But sometimes, in the folds of an old wool cloak, you can still feel the weight of that hammer, still smell the faint trace of the vat. Still, when you stepped into a fulling mill, the first thing that struck you wasn't the hammer, it was the heat. Not warmth, not comfort, moist heat, clinging to the inside of your throat, sinking into your joints, wrapping around your neck like a damp rag. The mill was always wet. Water from the troughs, steam from the soaking vats, condensation on the stone walls. It never dried, no matter the season. And neither did you. The air was thick with ammonia from urine, because that was the secret. That's what no one wanted to say too loudly. The mill stank not because of the water or the mold, but because every batch of cloth was soaked in human waste. It wasn't a secret, everyone knew. But no one talked about it, because it worked. Urine collected from chamber pots and public barrels was delivered in buckets or wagons by boys who hated their lives. It was poured into the troughs, mixed with water and clay and left to stew, sometimes for days. Then came the wool, rough, itchy, mottled with sheep grease and the sweat of the weaver. It went in as a soft, sagging fabric and came out tighter, thicker, denser. The hammer compressed it. The ammonia cleaned it. The fullers turned it every hour, their hands red and raw, their fingers permanently puckered from soaking. Many wrapped their hands in cloth. Others let the skin peel. No gloves, just pain. The hammers moved in sequence, mechanical, tireless. One, then the other. One, then the other. Driven by the wheel, driven by the river, driven by the simple fact that if they stopped, the mill stopped. And if the mill stopped, the orders were delayed. And if orders were delayed, the merchant got angry. And when the merchant got angry, someone's family starved, so the hammers never stopped. Workers slept beside the mill, rotating in shifts. Meals were eaten beside the troughs, boiled oats, dried onions, a heel of cheese if you were lucky. It all tasted like the mill eventually. The worst was winter. The water turned to slush. The air froze. But the mill still ran because wool shipments didn't wait for weather. Boys slipped on ice inside the building. Men lost fingers to frostbite. Their skin already softened from too much wet. Fullers wore layers under layers, their clothes soaked through within an hour of work. Sometimes they used oil to seal their sleeves, but it only delayed the misery. And still they came to work, because the job, as bad as it was, paid. Not well, but enough. Enough for bread, enough for salt, enough for candles in winter, and soap in summer. And in a village where most people begged for scraps, the man who worked at the fulling mill came home tired, but not empty-handed. He smelled terrible. His feet were swollen. His nails were cracked. But he had a coin or two, and that mattered. Some saved, dreamed of opening a stall, a butcher shop, a tavern. Most never made it that far. The average fuller's body began to break down by 30. Knees that wouldn't bend. Backs hunched from lifting heavy, sopping wool. Wrists that clicked and seized. Coughs that wouldn't go away. Lungs burned from ammonia steam and mold spores. Most died young but quietly, without spectacle. You won't find songs about them. No saints of wool, no tapestries depicting their work. But you'll find their fingers in the folds of cloaks and the seams of tunics. You'll find their pain pressed into every square of cloth that passed through their vats. There was pride sometimes, quiet pride. A worker might rub a bolt of finished cloth and nod once, knowing it would travel farther than he ever could. Worn by a merchant in Milan, a scholar in Oxford, a baron's squire in Aragon, all wrapped in the heat and labor of a man who had never left his valley. But fullers didn't boast. They were too tired for that. And when the hammer cracked, when a pin broke or the wheel slipped, it wasn't panic that filled the mill. It was fear. Because the only thing worse than the sound of the fulling mill was the silence when it stopped. So what happens when the hammer no longer falls and no one remembers the hands that once fed it? It doesn't end with a scream, or a fire, or a flood. It ends with one man not showing up to work. He's not sick. He just doesn't come, and no one asks why, because the others know. His knees gave out, his fingers stopped bending, his lungs wheezed like bellows in a rainstorm. He's not dead, just finished, done. Emptied by the endless rhythm of wool, hammer, and boiling air, So they wrap his cloak around his shoulders, hand him a crust of bread, and send him home. The mill doesn't pause, because cloth is still needed. Somewhere, a noble's. Order waits. 30 bolts for a winter wedding. Lined in fur, dyed in deep woad blue. Stitched by men with better reputations and softer hands. But before all that, before the feast, before the firelit hall, before the bride even sees her gown, there's the falling mill, there's the stink, the heat, the thud. That's the part no one invites into the story. The fulling mill outlasts the men who work it, because it was never about them. It was about the product, the cloth, the finish, the gleam when rubbed with wax, the even weave, the perfect tension, the absence of story. That's what made the cloth valuable. It carried no history. But that wasn't true. The fulling mill was a graveyard of small memories. Fingertips lost to the press. Shoes left by the door, never reclaimed. A name carved into a beam, already worn. Your way. A bowl once used for lunch, now full of mouse droppings. The building stood even when the wheel jammed, even when the stream changed course, even when the orders stopped. No one tore it down, they just stopped entering it. A few boys would dare each other to peek inside. They'd say you could still hear the hammers, still see steam rising from empty troughs, still smell the rot. They'd press their ears to the walls and whisper that the cloth never stopped moving, because part of them knew, beneath the jokes, that something had lived here. Not something holy. Not something noble, but something real. And when the last man to work the mill died, old and bent, remembered only for how quiet he was, someone hung a scrap of his cloak in the rafters. Not as a tribute, not as a symbol, just because it felt wrong to throw it away. It stayed there for years, faded, shredded by wind and mice. Eventually it looked like part of the building itself, and maybe that was the point, because fullers were never meant to be remembered by name. But their work? It was everywhere. In cloaks worn by scholars, in banners flown at court, in funeral shrouds, wrapped around noble bones, even in books, leather bindings smoothed with cloth pounded in a forgotten valley, by men who never learned to read. Their lives were measured not in stories, but in fibers stretched and flesh sacrificed, and so the fulling mill stood, long after its doors had rotted off their hinges, empty, quiet, but never clean, because in the silence, the cloth still whispers. This was made with pain. Before. The tower clocks, before the pocket watches and the chimes, before gears, pendulums, and ticking seconds, there was sound. The shape of your day in a medieval village wasn't told by hands on a dial but by bells, and you learned early that time didn't come from above, but from around you. A child growing up in the 13th or 14th century didn't learn hours from numbers. He learned them from rhythms, the way the light shifted on the floor, the way the geese turned at midday, the way the baker's boy shouted when the first loaves were ready, the way the village bell tower gave one slow groan to summon the day. From sleep. There was no standard hour, because there were no standard lives. You lived in canonical time if you lived near a monastery. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. The bell rang for each prayer, and if you heard it and knew what it meant, your life bent around those sounds like a vine curling to light. But if you lived in the fields, time was marked differently. You woke when the sky turned silver. You ate when the first crow landed on the fence post. You worked until the shade touched the third tree in the orchard. For most people, time was a texture, not a number. A woman stirring porridge could tell how long to wait, not by a clock, but by the way steam moved from the pot A shepherd knew when to bring the flock home by the slope of the sun's shadow on the hill. A blacksmith counted heartbeats between bellows. A weaver hummed the same verse again and again until a row was finished. But in towns and abbeys, bells ruled, cast in bronze, hung on ropes thick with sweat and weather. Some rang flat, others rang bright. Each had a name, each had a meaning. One bell called you to worship, another warned you of fire. One bell meant the gates were closing, another meant someone had died, and when they all rang together, it meant something terrible or miraculous was happening. In some villages, a boy was chosen to ring the bell. He'd climb the narrow stairs each day, his fingers stained with rope fibers. He learned how to pull with just the right weight. Too soft, and the bell choked. Too hard, and the rope could whip and split a lip. The bell had a voice, and you had to let it speak gently. The bell didn't just tell you what time it was. It told you what kind of time it was. Was it time to gather, to mourn, to run? People lived by bells without ever seeing them. Some lived their whole lives without touching. A dial, a sundial, or a timepiece, but they knew what time it was by the world's behavior. The church bell at prime might tell the ploughman to start. The sex bell meant pause, shade, water. The nun bell meant the sun was angling down, the light sharpening, and soon it would be time to go home. And what about those who wandered? Tinkers, messengers, pilgrims. They marked time by the churches they passed. A bell at Vespers in one village might reach your ears a mile away, soft, silver, swallowed by leaves. It told you where you were and where you weren't. It said, here is civilization, here is structure, here is safety. But the bells didn't only belong to the church. Some manors had bells to mark the labor shifts. Some mills rang bells to let villagers know when the flour was ready. Some town gates rang bells before they were locked. And when someone died, someone important, a tolling began at dusk and didn't stop until the body was buried. Even bells had a lifespan. The bronze cracked, the ropes frayed, and when the voice of the bell changed, the village felt it. Some believed a bell's tone reflected the health of the village. If it rang clear, all was well. If it rang dull, something was wrong. But what happens to a world that tells time with sound when the bell goes silent? The bell ropes were rough. Braided hemp, oiled with tallow, darkened by hands that pulled them hundreds, thousands of times. The rope didn't swing freely. It resisted. It had memory. It remembered the strength of the man who last rang it. It remembered the rhythm of grief, of feasts, of war. When the bell rang, it did so into a world that listened, because in a village without clocks, you didn't measure time alone. You felt it together. The bell didn't only tell you when to act, it told you that others were doing the same. When it rang at Sext, you knew the ploughman was turning his oxen. When it rang at Compline, you knew the old widow 3 doors down was whispering her prayers by candlelight. When it rang for a funeral, you didn't need to ask who died. You just opened the door and walked. There were signals in the sound. A slow tolling, 1 beat every few breaths, meant death. A quick triple ring meant fire. A chime at the wrong hour, that meant someone had erred, or worse, someone had rung. It in haste, and haste was dangerous, because haste in timekeeping meant disorder, and disorder led to panic. And panic, in a world already sharp with plague and crop failure, was a form of contagion. So the bell ringer bore a heavy task. In some villages he lived in the church, in others beside it. He had no wealth, but he had trust. He knew how much to pull, how long to wait between rings. He was taught to feel the rope's language. And when he died, the job passed. Father to son, or apprentice to apprentice, or sometimes to no one at all. That was the beginning of silence. Some villages simply stopped. No more bell ringer, no one strong enough, no one who knew the sequence. And so the bell sat still. At first, the villagers noticed. They asked if it was broken. They stood in doorways at vespers, waiting for a sound that never came. They looked up at the tower with questions in their eyes. Then they stopped asking. They rose with the sun and guessed at the hour. They ate when the goats returned. They prayed when the shadows reached the base of the wall. Time went from sound to guesswork, and slowly people learned to live without it. But those who had heard the bell in childhood, they never stopped hearing it entirely. Some swore they could still feel it, vibrating faintly beneath the floorboards. Some said their dreams came in pulses, like a rope pulling them up through memory. One woman, old and half-blind, said she still knew when to milk the cow because her bones rang like bronze. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was imprint. Because when a bell rang every day of your life, when it told you when to eat, when to kneel, when to run, you didn't forget it. You carried it, and some bells were taken by armies, by thieves, melted into cannon or coin, hung in foreign towers. Their tones changed, their meanings erased. A bell that once called peasants to prime now warned of French cannons. A bell that once rang for marriage now rang for plague curfew. Same bronze, different world. And when mechanical clocks appeared, towers with gears and dials and bells that rang with ruthless precision, something changed again. The sound was still there, but the meaning had shifted. The bell no longer told you to rest. It told you what you were late for. It didn't wait for birdsong or field shadows. It rang at the same time, no matter the season, the weather, or the wheat. It was a clock's bell now, not the world's. And though people adapted, something was lost. The softness, the community, the shared silence before the sound. Because the old bell let time breathe, let it stretch, let it move like smoke across the valley. And now, the bells still ring, but do we still listen? What happens to time when it no longer belongs to us? There's a story passed quietly in a hilltop village, no longer marked on most maps, about a bell that never rang again. It wasn't stolen. It wasn't broken. It was simply left behind. The village had changed. Roads moved. Trade slowed. The young left. The fields shrank. And the church, still upright, still casting its shadow over empty pews, remained silent. But the bell remained, hanging, waiting, bound by its own stillness. A child once climbed the tower, fingers scraped on stone, just to see it. The old men said he sat beside it for hours, listening, not to the bell, but to the silence around it. They said if you sat long enough, you could hear what the bell used to say. Because even silence remembers. Before mechanical time took over, time was not carved into seconds. It was made of tasks, textures, and trust. A day wasn't divided by 15-minute meetings. It was divided by sounds and sunlight, the creak of the bread oven, the splash of the well bucket, the rustle of the oxen when they stood to stretch in, the early light, and above all the bell. The bell reminded people of their place in time, not just their hour, their role. It said, you are part of this. It said, the village breathes with you. It said, now we rest, now we work, now we remember. But the arrival of mechanical clocks broke time into fragments. It became less a river and more a ladder, each rung exact. Each hour no longer sensed but measured. No softness, no sky, no soil. And the bell. It still rang, but it rang for the machine, no longer to guide the plow. Now to chime the quarter hour, to regulate, to discipline, to remind people of the outside. World's time, not their own. Yet even now in remote valleys and empty chapels, some bells still ring the old way. A single chime at dawn, not 6 a.m., but when the light breaks. Another at dusk, not 6 p.m., but when the shadows reach the road's end. They don't match the city's time, and that's the point, because village time was never meant to be precise. It was meant to be true to the cow's breath, to the frost's edge, to the patience of the orchard, to the slowness of grief. And though many of us now wear time on our wrists in glowing digits and vibrating alarms, the body remembers something else. The moment before the bell, the silence, the waiting, that space where time wasn't counted, but shared. So next time you hear a bell, perhaps from a church across the city or a clock tower rising above traffic, pause. Just for a moment, not to mark the hour, but to listen for the echo of what it once meant. That time was never ours to own, only something we lived within, like breath. Before the tattoo parlor, before electric buzzers, before flash sheets on the wall and antiseptic wipes. There was a man with a needle, a pot of soot, and a long memory. He didn't hang a sign, didn't call out in the market. You wouldn't find his name in the guild register. But if you whispered in the right ear, maybe the tanner's boy, maybe the fishwife, someone would nod and point you toward the edge of town. That's where he worked, in the shadows, in the warmth of an open hearth, surrounded by scraps of cloth, bowls of ash, and tools that looked like they belonged in a surgeon's kit. Because in medieval Europe, tattooing didn't exist in public, but it never disappeared. People came quietly, after dark, wrapped in cloaks. Some came for symbols, some for saints, some for sins they could never confess in a church. He never asked why, only where. He was the tattooist, though they never called him that. He was just the one who marks. His ink was made of soot and wine, sometimes crushed berries, sometimes rust. It was thick, gritty, unrefined. He stirred it with a bone stick and kept it covered, not for hygiene, but for luck. His tools were needles, iron or bone, some tied to sticks, others held bare in the fingers. They weren't new, they were seasoned. They had seen skin of every color and age, farmers' wrists, thieves' ankles, pilgrims' shoulders. He worked slowly, carefully. He pressed the needle in by hand, tap by tap, drop by drop. And it hurt. There was no numbing, no distraction, no quick escape. You sat, you clenched your jaw, you endured, because every mark had meaning. Some came for protection, a cross above the heart, a saint's emblem on the palm, a symbol of divine watching. Especially before battle. Soldiers believed ink on the body meant the soul couldn't be lost. If they died far from home, their tattoo would speak for them. Some came for punishment because tattooing wasn't always voluntary. In some places, thieves were marked on the face, heretics on the shoulder, slaves on the back. Branding was common, but when skin was too burned, ink was used instead, to show ownership, to show shame, to make sure no one forgot. And so the tattooist served two worlds. Some came for memory, a symbol for a lost brother, a date scratched in shaky numbers, a lover's initial hidden on the thigh. The tattooist never asked if they still lived. He only made the line as straight as he could, though his hands shook, more than they used to. He worked by firelight. Not because he preferred it, but because privacy was more valuable than sunlight. He didn't want crowds. He didn't want watchmen. And he especially didn't want the church, because officially tattooing was seen as pagan, unholy, a desecration of the sacred body. Unless, of course, it was done in Jerusalem, because there in the Holy Land, Christian pilgrims often received small tattoos as proof of their journey, a cross on the wrist, a palm, a shoulder. Even monks allowed it quietly. It was not vanity, they said, but a spiritual badge, something they could show God at the gate of heaven. The tattooist had never been to Jerusalem, but he had copied the symbols from those who had. He kept them in a book. Not parchment, not vellum, just folded scraps, drawings done in charcoal, smeared by time. A fish, a sword, a star, a broken wheel, a woman's face with closed eyes. Symbols no one asked for anymore, but he remembered them. Sometimes, when the fire burned low and no one came for days, he would draw them again in the ashes on the floor, just to make sure he still could. But what happens when the man who carries everyone's stories is no longer remembered by anyone? There are things the church couldn't see. It saw sin in ink, saw idolatry, saw vanity. But it didn't see what the man with the needle saw, quiet desperation. Because the people who came to him didn't want attention. They wanted memory, or protection, or escape. He marked pilgrims first. They came after months on foot, sunburnt, hollow-eyed, knees raw from prayer. They'd seen the bones of saints, bathed in holy springs, kissed every relic they could reach. But before they returned to their farms and their chores, they needed something that wouldn't wash away. Some asked for a Jerusalem cross, a palm, frond, a fish, or the name of a saint in trembling Latin. They'd hold out a wrist, palm up, eyes shut, and the needle would begin. A few wept, not from pain, but from something else. A release. The moment ink touched skin, the pilgrimage became real. Not just a story told at market, not just a ribbon pinned to a coat, but a mark carried until the body gave out. The tattooist understood that. He'd never left his town, but his marks had. Across valleys, mountains, even seas, carried by soldiers, scribes, mothers, and monks. The skin was map and memory, and he was the quiet cartographer. Then came the soldiers. They were different, louder, joking, always drunk. They asked for animals, lions, hounds, snakes, not for faith, for fear. Because in battle, fear was useful. A dog inked on your arm made you feel like one. A serpent on your chest made your breath feel sharper. One knight asked for a skull, not drawn well, just enough to see it and remember. So I don't forget where this ends, he said. Some had him ink their names, their birth towns, the name of a brother or a wife. Not for sentiment, but for identification. Because if they died in foreign soil, stripped and thrown in a pit, they wanted something on the body that said, "This was me." The tattooist never asked what happened afterward, but he noticed when the same young soldiers stopped coming back, and when the same name was requested again, this time by a grieving friend. Then there were the women. They came quietly, wrapped in shawls, sometimes bruised, sometimes alone, sometimes whispering the name of someone they used to love. They didn't ask for roses or poems. They asked for symbols, a circle with a dot, a charm for fertility, a bird in flight, a mark of survival. A crescent moon, protection from cruel men. Some asked for the removal of old tattoos, not with knives, just inked over, a name blotted out, a symbol darkened, sometimes replaced, sometimes erased. The tattooist did what he could, but he knew. Skin never truly forgets. His own arms bore a few marks, faded, uneven. One was a set of lines, short and crude, a date, perhaps, a loss. He never explained it. The ink was made fresh every few days. Soot from the fire mixed with wine or vinegar. If he had access to copper dust, he'd mix that in, or gall, or even blood. Not much, just enough to bind the memory into the skin. He used bone needles for small lines, iron for thick ones. Each tool was cleaned with heat, then scraped, then prayed over. Yes, he prayed. Not aloud, but silently before each mark. Not to saints, not to God, to the skin. He believed the body could accept or reject the memory. And he saw it happen. Some marks healed cleanly, became part of the body like birthmarks. Others festered, refused the ink, raised in scars. The body chose, even when the mind didn't. That made his job sacred and dangerous, because if the bishop found out, if the wrong monk came asking, if someone whispered the wrong name into the wrong ear, he could be dragged through the town, accused of sorcery, of defilement, of paganism. There were stories of tattooists burned, of their tools melted down, of their clients excommunicated, but no one ever spoke of what the ink had meant to them, because you couldn't confess a tattoo, you could only carry it. So the man with the needle worked quietly, marking time, marking memory, marking you. But what does it mean when the body becomes the only place left for truth to live? By the end of his life, the tattooist had no apprentices, no sons, no trade guild to welcome him, no written record of the years he spent bent over skin, ink seeping into his nails, the smell of soot and wine lingering in the folds of his coat. But his work had traveled, worn by men who died in forests, by women who outlived 5 winters alone, by children whose names were never recorded, but who bore a crescent moon behind one ear, or a faded bird beneath the collarbone. Each mark whispered a story the world had no room to tell. He kept his tools in a cloth bundle, soft from use, blood stiff at the corners. Not many tools, just enough, a few needles, a worn knife, a spoon blackened from fire, and the scraps of parchment he used to copy designs, his memory written in soot. Sometimes the people who came to him didn't know what they wanted. They just needed to be marked, to say I existed, to say this mattered, to say don't forget me even if I forget myself. He understood that better than anyone. He had long since stopped asking for names. He referred to people by where they hurt. The woman with the burned arm, the man who lost, a son in Florence, the boy who couldn't speak but kept pointing to his chest. Some he saw only once. Others returned years later, their marks faded, stretched, aged with them. One old man came back to have his wife's name redone, just her, first initial, because his skin had blurred it with time. He said he wanted to take it to the grave with him. Clear as the day she said yes. The tattooist didn't smile much, but that day he did. His own back was marked, not visible unless he removed his shirt, but there, across his spine, were 6 small lines, vertical, faint. Each one inked by another hand years ago. Some said they marked his children. Others said his losses. No one ever asked, because the man who marked others never spoke of himself. Not out of secrecy, but out of honor. To him, skin was sacred, not beautiful, not fashionable, not political, just sacred. A place to hold the things too heavy for the mouth, the grief that had no song, the joy that couldn't be spoken in a crowded room, the story that didn't belong in books or sermons. He marked it all. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but faithfully. And when he grew too old to hold the needle steady, he stopped working. Didn't announce it, just wrapped his tools, sealed them in a box, hid them beneath the floorboards. The last mark he ever gave was for a girl, maybe 16. Single black line across the inside of her wrist. She didn't say what it meant. He didn't ask. She thanked him with a piece of bread still warm. He nodded and never marked another. Years later, when strangers passed through the village, they'd sometimes spot someone with a curious old tattoo, a circle broken at one edge, a lamb with a cross, a woman's face drawn in 3 strokes, and when they asked where it came from, the answer was always the same. From the man before time counted us. Because his marks didn't follow trends. They didn't fade with fashion. They lived in the layer beneath memory, the one that stays even when you forget why you started, even when the words have rotted away, even when the skin wrinkles and the eyes dim. There, beneath all of that, the mark still remains. And what better legacy than to be remembered in silence every time someone runs their finger across an old line and thinks, not of the artist, but of what they survived. You didn't choose this job. No one ever did. You were either too old to fight, too poor to leave, or too unlucky to be spared. And when the carts came rattling through the alleys, the man holding the reins looked at you, just you, and said the words that would follow you to your grave. You'll ride with the dead today. It was 1350. The Black Death had already taken your neighbors, your cousins, your midwife, your priest. The bells had stopped ringing because there were no hands left to ring them. The graveyard was full and it clung to your fingers even after scrubbing. It followed you into sleep. It stayed in your nose when you bit into bread. It lived in your hair. And it wasn't just death. It was rot and heat, and the sour tang of blood turned to water. Some said plague victims smelled sweet. That's how you knew it was in the air. You stopped smelling sweetness after the first month. Everything just smelled thick. You carried tools, a long hooked pole for pulling bodies, a canvas wrap for dragging what couldn't be lifted, a small clay pot of quicklime to scatter over the wet patches where the body had melted into the floor. And always a rag, not to protect yourself, that was hopeless, but to bite down on when the worst part came, because sometimes the bodies moved, not alive, just bloated, swollen with gas. They'd shift, groan, leak. You learned to tie the mouth shut before dragging them. And the eyes. You stopped looking at the eyes. The houses were marked with chalk. A red X meant plague confirmed. A black circle meant everyone inside was dead. A line across the door meant, do not enter. You entered anyway, inside silence. Or worse, whispers. Sometimes you found the last child curled under a bed, not yet cold. Sometimes a mother clutching her infant, both gone, mouths still open from screaming. Sometimes nothing, just a stain on the floor and a chair tipped sideways. The dead were rarely in beds. They died where they fell, at the table, on the stairs, in corners. You didn't pray anymore. You worked. You wrapped the body. You dragged it out. You burned the mattress. You poured vinegar on the floor. You shoveled. Ashes. You scattered lime. You sealed the door with pitch if there was any left. If not, just nailed it shut. And you moved on. No one thanked you. They looked at you like they'd already buried you. Children crossed themselves. Dogs ran. Men gave you food without touching your hand. Women stared, mouths tight. Some said plague. Cleaners were cursed. That your soul rotted as fast as the corpses. Some said you caused the plague by angering God with your closeness to the dead. Some said you were marked for hell. You didn't argue. You kept moving, because the carts never stopped and the city wasn't empty yet. But what happens when you start seeing the dead in your sleep, and the only face you can't forget is your own? You stopped counting after the first 100 bodies. It didn't matter anymore how many, how fast, how deep. The pit was always open, the cart was never empty, and your hands never felt clean. You began to notice the way people avoided you. Not out of cruelty, out of instinct. As if they could smell the death on your skin, the lime dust in your hair, the rot behind your eyes. You learned how to lift bodies without tearing them, how to slide a small child into the cloth so they wouldn't slip through, how to hold your breath when the belly split and something warm spilled out, and you learned never to look into a mirror after work, because your eyes changed, not from sickness, from knowing what it meant to carry the world's filth and be thanked with silence. They called you a plague cleaner, but you were really a grave walker, a guilt sponge, a memory that no one wanted to keep. Some nights you couldn't sleep. The bodies came back, not whole, but in pieces, a hand dragging behind, a face turned toward the ceiling with no eyes left to see, a moan that wasn't real but somehow still followed you. You stopped dreaming, started drinking. If you could find ale, you drank it fast and hot. If not, water mixed with herbs just to feel something burn. And then came the walls. Not the stone ones, the ones you built inside yourself. You stopped remembering names. You stopped asking if anyone was still inside when you entered a house. You stopped knocking. You started assuming they were already dead, or worse, soon to be. Once a woman grabbed your hand as you wrapped her daughter. She begged you to leave the child, promised she would get better. You didn't say a word. You lifted the girl, the mother screamed. You closed the door behind you. She died 2 days later, alone in a sealed house. They found her body curled near the ashes of the fireplace. You didn't go in. Someone else did. And you nodded as the cart passed by. That's how the job worked. You didn't save. You contained. Every house you entered, you left worse. Not because of cruelty, because that was the job. You scraped sickness off the floor. You shoveled hope into pits. You boiled the linens or burned them when there wasn't enough water. You scattered lime like salt. You nailed the doors shut like coffins, and you moved on. Sometimes people followed you, not to thank you, to watch to see what death looked like up close, to count how many bags you carried out of a neighbor's home, to whisper stories about how it began. Was it a merchant, a rat, a curse? You ignored them. You kept walking, because the only truth you knew was this: the bell never rang for the plague cleaner. There was no mass said for you, no blessing for the man who touched the dead, no last rites when you finally collapsed. When it came for you, and it always did, you would be thrown into the same pit you had filled for months, unmarked, unmourned, unspoken. But what happens when the world forgets the only people who kept it from falling apart? They say the plague ended, eventually. They say the carts stopped rolling, the bells rang again, children returned to the streets, markets reopened, people married, buried and baptized like they used to, but not for you. Because when your work stopped, you didn't go back to a field or a forge or a stall in the square. There was nothing to return to. You had become part of the plague, the shape it wore after death, the hand that lingered after the fire had burned down, and the houses, those sealed houses, remained for a long time, blackened doors, boards warped by weather, chalk marks still visible beneath the rain streaks. People crossed themselves when they passed. Others took stones and bricked them in, because even after the dead were gone, the memory stayed. You walked by them daily. You knew what lay beneath: the toy left under the bench, the comb on the table, the footprints in ash, the bones in some still resting beneath the floorboards where they had fallen too fast for you to carry, and no one wanted to talk about that. The plague, they decided, was over, but it lived in your lungs. You still coughed, your eyes still watered at night. Your hands trembled when you reached for the bread oven's handle. People began to recognize you again, not with fear, but with something worse: pity. The innkeeper left food out, but never invited you in. The priest nodded, but never offered confession. The children stopped pointing and simply looked away, and still, you remembered. All of it. the warm weight of a child in your arms, just before she turned cold. The priest who died on the altar mid-blessing, still gripping the chalice. The moment you dragged your own cousin from her home, too far gone to speak. You remembered not because you wanted to, because no one else would. You kept a bundle of rags hidden in a basket, your mask, your last pot of lime. You couldn't bring yourself to burn them. Maybe you thought it might come back, or maybe a part of you hoped it would, because at least then you would have purpose again. You weren't a cleaner anymore. You were just a man with scars that couldn't be seen. Asman who had opened more doors than he closed. A man who had walked through more endings than beginnings. And when the next generation was born, those who hadn't seen the carts, or smelled the ash, or watched the sun go down on 10 funerals, a day they stopped believing the stories. They said you were exaggerating, that people didn't really die in piles, that the air couldn't have been that thick, that the bells never fell silent, and so you said nothing. You simply stood at the edge of the village near the last house you ever sealed, overgrown now, swallowed in vines, and you waited. Not for death, not even for memory, but for someone, anyone to ask, what was it like? So you could say it wasn't the dying that haunted us, it was how fast we forgot the dead. Before the king's coin could be trusted, before guild stamps and sealed jugs, before alehouses lined the street like chickens in a coop, someone had to taste the beer, and not just anyone. There was a man for that, a man who didn't farm, didn't forge, didn't fight, but whose tongue held more authority than a squire's blade. He was the ale tester, not a noble title, not even a well-paid one. But in the late 1300s, especially in market towns, it was as vital as the thatcher or the well-keeper, because bad ale could kill you, not with poison, but with infection. Ale was safer than water in many places. It boiled out the filth. It soothed the stomach. It carried calories, warmth, and sometimes even a faint, forgettable joy. And if it was brewed wrong, if it soured too soon, if it sat too long, if the wrong bark or flour was tossed in, the result was not just undrinkable. It was dangerous. Enter the man with the wooden stick, the wool cloak, and the dark-stained lips. The ale tester came without fanfare. He travelled on foot or cart. He wore no badge. But the sight of him made tavern keepers straighten their backs, rinse their mugs and eye the barrel with a nervous twitch.